Hello, I'm Ray Kirkus, and I want to talk to you today about the militarization of the police. I'm going to start with a little story. That on May 5th, in the morning, about 9:30 in the morning, Jose Garina, who was a military veteran Marine who had served 2 tours of duty in Iraq, was at home sleeping in his Tucson area home in Arizona. He had just worked a 12-hour shift at a local copper mine, and he was home resting. In the adjoining bedroom, his wife and his 4-year-old boy were talking. She was turning cartoons on for him, getting ready to make him breakfast and getting him dressed. Vanessa, his wife, had just heard a loud boom explosion in the backyard. Unsure of what it was, she went to look and peered through the blinds. When she looked outside, she saw men with guns mulling around the property. Being very concerned, she went to wake up her husband. I need to point out at this point in time that Vanessa's family members, two of whom were executed, killed in a home invasion just about a year before. Even the 2 children in that family were shot, but they survived. And keeping this in mind, Vanessa wasn't sure what was going on, but was assuming that it was another home invasion and that they were the targets. So she ran and abruptly woke up her husband. Jose jumped up, told her and their son to hide in the closet and to call the police. And she basically got into the closet and called 911 on her cell phone. At that same time, Jose Garina grabbed an AR-15 rifle that he had, and he went to position himself to defend his home. At that moment, the front door broke open, and in a hail of gunfire, 71 shots were fired into the home. 22 of those shots hit Jose Garina, and he fell to the floor, lying in a pool of blood, and in his boxer shorts, bled to death without getting any medical attention. The question is, what happened here? Was this a home invasion by a bunch of home invaders, or was this another botched SWAT raid? Well, in this case, it was a botched SWAT raid. Pima County SWAT team, working with other municipal agencies, initiated the warrant. They were looking for drugs, specifically marijuana. They found nothing. No drugs were found in the home, and Jose's body tested negative for any drugs. All the guns that Jose had in the house were all legally acquired, and even the gun that he had in his hand was never fired, and the safety was still on after he was killed. The testimony of one of the SWAT officers was that he had thought he saw a flash come from Jose's gun and that they opened fire. However, the truth of the matter later came out that one of the SWAT officers had tripped and discharged his weapon, and after that first shot was fired, the other 70 shots quickly followed. Now, this all happened in less than a minute, much less time than it took me to even explain it to you. And this is becoming the norm for a lot of SWAT raids that are now going down across the country. So what I want to tell you about today is a little bit about the history of standing armies and what they mean, a little bit about how they tie in to local policing and a very brief history of local policing and how it turned into the law enforcement that we have today. I also want to touch base a little bit about the costs to society of all these things that are going on, and lastly, what we can do about it. For several years, I've been researching these types of issues. I have been attempting to work with community groups. I've spoken to the Tea Party groups. I've spoken to our commissioners. I've spoken to city councils. I've been very vocal and open about this, exposing what seems to be a trend. Ferguson actually was one of the first major things that started showing what militarization of police departments can do. The Posse Comitatus Act was was put in place to make sure that there was a distinction between military and the police. But with the making of SWAT teams and the usage of SWAT teams, this is pretty much a blurred line at this point. So what are standing armies? Well, most dictionaries will agree that standing armies are professionally paid military forces that are sustained and maintained by a nation. The difference between a regular army and a standing army is that the standing army is still maintained in peaceful times. Standing armies are nothing new. They go back to the cradle of civilization, 3,000 years BC in ancient Sumer, or Mesopotamia as the Greeks called it, which is now present-day Iraq. The Sumerian civilization was very diverse, very much like the United States is today. And from that civilization were artisans and priests and government bureaucrats, and of course the first recorded professional army, as in cuneiform, which is the ancient language that is transcribed from the Sumerians. It seems to be that these armies were rather large and went around occupying different lands. So, also British monarchs kept huge standing armies during peacetime. John Trenchard, who was a very, very vocal about writing about political issues back in the 1700s, in the 16th century, wrote about standing armies in his writings called A Collection of Tracts, and this was in 1751. He said, "The subject is so self-evident that I am almost ashamed to prove it. For if we look through the world, we shall find in no country liberty and an army standing together, so that to know whether a people are free or slaves, it is necessary only to ask whether is it an army kept amongst them." And eventually in England, the Parliament, after the First and Second Civil War of England, they kind of put checks and balances on standing armies that the king had control over. So a lot of people believe that the king had a total control of the monarchy, had total control. However, it was not quite that way. The Parliament had a lot to do with that, and there were a lot of free people, so to say, that were in England at that time. So skipping forward, we can take a look at what happened with our founders and how our founders looked at this, dealing with Britain and their standing army on our lands. The colonists wrote a lot about standing armies, both in the Federalist Papers and in local publications in New England. Before, during the Revolution, they talked about standing armies. They knew what the cost was for them. At the Constitutional Convention, I mean, James Madison talked about a standing army as the greatest mischief that can happen. He said, "The means in defense against foreign danger have always been the instruments of tyranny at home. Amongst the Romans, it was a standing maxim to excite a war whenever a revolt was apprehended. Throughout all of Europe, the armies kept up under the pretext of defending have enslaved the people." Numerous essays were published in those publications I mentioned. Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, agreed with the Anti-Federalists with the problems with standing armies. He went on to say, this is in Federalist Paper number 56 that was published, "Schemes to subvert the liberties of a great community require time to mature them for execution. An army so large as to seriously to menace those liberties could only be formed by progressive augmentations, which would suppose not merely a temporary combination between the legislature and executive, but a continued conspiracy for a series of time." It's kind of clear to see what he's saying here is that it's an incremental, step-by-step method. Little by little, they encroach on your liberties, under the guise of war, under the guise of a boogeyman, under the guise that something's bad. Put that in perspective as what's happening today. So in the end, the founders did put together Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12 in our Constitution, which limited the federal government powers and which limited a standing army to be raised in times of war and to be held and reauthorized only for a period of 2 years. Definitely not what Congress is doing today. So now you have a general idea of what standing armies are. Let's run through a quick history of professional policing and see if we could tie the two together. Standing armies were seen as a threat to liberty, principally because their allegiance is not to the people they're supposed to defend, but to the paymaster. Whoever pays their salary, feeds them, clothes them, that's where their allegiance lies. as opposed to militias, as opposed to self-policing, as opposed to defending yourself and your neighbors, where your allegiance lies to you and your family. This is a different kind of situation. So original policing began as kin policing. Like I said, people defended themselves, people kept their families in check. If something was out of control in their family, they took care of that situation. So it was called kin policing. And this dated back to about 900 AD. America's first known police force was established in Boston in about 1630, where the ordinances were finally passed to establish a constable, allowed for constables, and to have appointed constables and townspeople making up watch groups that would go around putting out fires, lighting street lights, keeping the peace, and apprehending criminals. And they would actually go around and yell. They would hue and cry if something happened to somebody, in order to raise awareness that a criminal might be doing something, and then you need to apprehend that criminal. In more rural areas, the governors, not governors of the state, but the governors appointed by the king, by the crown, would appoint sheriffs. And those sheriffs were responsible for keeping the peace in the more rural areas, and they would serve legal documents, and they would actually even collect taxes. And by 1829, and this again was basically a reactive police force. It was always reacting to a crime. It was not proactive. In England in 1829, this changed a little bit, and they started putting together more of a preemptive police force, which was supposed to deter crime rather than just go after criminals after already committing the crime. And this carried over to the United States in 1883, when Philadelphia became the very first city with an organized 24-hour on-call police force. And from this design that started back then is what we pretty much have today, the 24-hour on-call professional police. Not volunteers, but regular police that get paid for what they do. Now, SWAT teams, where did they come from? They came around about 1964 and also originated, amazingly, in Philadelphia. But they weren't popularized or had any notoriety until in 1967, the LAPD started using them. And they were used for what? They were used for very, very serious things. What is SWAT? SWAT is an acronym for Special Weapons and Tactical. And SWAT teams were designed for very, very high-risk operations. It was any kind of barricaded gunman who might be shooting innocent people, or if it was some other kind of shooter, hostage situations where people's lives were at risk. This is when SWAT teams were sent in to protect and try to minimize the damage and actually have more firepower than the people that they're dealing with. This was the original design. And little by little, SWAT teams began to grow and multiply across the country. They're also equipped and trained more like the military than your typical street cop. I mean, they don't drive around in a police car. They basically have more of an armored vehicle. They have body armor. They have better weapons. They have ways to break into the houses and buildings. They have much more training than your typical police officer for those special situations. And they have a bunch of different things in their arsenal, much more than the regular street cop with a service revolver or a shotgun. And they have fully automatic machine guns. They have grenade launchers, tear gas, grenade launchers that launch tear gas. They have a multitude of things. They have robotic vehicles, remote control robotic vehicles. So they have a lot more in their arsenal than your typical street cop does, for good reason. To compound the issue, though, because they are more soldier-esque, and that's a lot of times gets criticism because they are more soldier-esque, they are employed nowadays for more questionable purposes, and this is where a lot of the criticism is coming from. And to compound on that problem, because of all the wars that the United States has been fighting since the 1990s, it's endless. There's so much surplus military equipment, which is far different than just getting Jeeps back under the old programs where military equipment would come by and you get a 2.5-ton truck or something usable for a community. The 1033 program is something the Congress put together that would allow for local municipalities and police departments, law enforcement agencies to use, but only for two things. It's very specific. It has to be used for counterterrorism, or it has to be used for drug enforcement. It can't be really used for anything else. It can't be used for speculative purposes in the future. And therefore, the state has an agreement with the Department of Defense. Every state has what they call an MOA or MOU, Memorandum of Agreement or Memorandum of Understanding. And these are the rules that are set forth in what these things can be used for. And these items under this program, 1033 program, which is designed by the National Defense Authorization Act, it's a section in there, 1033, allows for a lot of this equipment to be filtered down to local policing agencies, law enforcement agencies. And this includes everything from mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, airplanes, helicopters, machine guns, grenade launchers, all the way to microwave stoves, MOGs, all kinds of different equipment that can be utilized and used by the departments, as long as they're being used for those specific reasons. So this is where you come into play with Ferguson. They showed off a lot of this militaristic equipment in Ferguson. Although it wasn't all, it was there, and a lot of this is being utilized by SWAT teams. So now the tactics are very militaristic. The appearance and the dress makes SWAT team officers look like black op commandos in the military. In 1975, there were about 500 SWAT units across the country. Today there are thousands. By the early 1980s, there were 3,000. In 2005, almost 10 years ago, there were 50,000 SWAT raids across the country, and far, far too many of them resulted in similar situations as the one I opened this talk with. So the problem with this and the frequency of these raids is getting to the point where they are no longer used for these very specific purposes, but they are actually being used to serve misdemeanor warrants to pick up people for child support payments. I mean, it is really, really getting to be ridiculous, and there's a lot of information out there supporting what I'm saying. So I've covered this pretty much as far as the brief history of standing armies. I've kind of talked to you a little bit about how police agencies came around to being what they are today. I'm very limited for time on this. I've also talked to you a little bit about SWAT teams, what they mean and what they're supposed to do and what they're doing now, and their tie-in with the Department of Defense and all the hardware that is normally used by the military that is now trickling down into local law enforcement agencies. So what do we have to think about? What are these costs? I mean, if we take that first example that I gave you, which is only one, and there are hundreds and hundreds that I could show you across the net on the internet, the costs that were awarded to Mr. Guerrina's family, Vanessa's family, was $3.4 million in wrongful death. This is what they collected. In addition to that $3.4 million, you have a life that was lost. You have children without a father. This goes on and on across the board. There are other cases that usually settle for anywhere from police brutality, where people are hurt and injured, to police killings. And this comes because of the way that the system is set up. It's the training that does this. A lot of these awards run from the range of $1 million to $10 million for wrongful death suits, but the officers actually are cleared of any wrongdoing. And you might wonder why. Well, these people, they're trigger happy. They pulled the trigger too soon. They are trained to do that. The training has changed since 9/11. That everything has changed since September 11, 2001. The old training that was in the police academy from the officers that have been there since before 2005 see the change when they go to the academies and they see what's going on. The new training that was originally provided by the Department of Defense through the Department of Homeland Security in about 2005-2006 by Michael Chertoff is totally different. It's more in your face. It's more pull the trigger first, ask questions later. It's more to protect against any situation that might come up, regardless of how minuscule it might be, for the safety of the SWAT team. As a perfect example, I could say that if the SWAT team kicks in the door of a house and they see a gentleman holding the knife, or I say gentleman, a man holding a knife at the kitchen, they are supposed to shoot first, because that person might run at them with the knife and cut the guy, and he'll drop the gun, and he'll get the gun, and he'll shoot the SWAT team up, which is absolutely ridiculous. But these are the scenarios that they use to justify these actions, and that's why these officers are cleared. And not only are they cleared, they're usually put back on their same duty that they were originally. And the cost to society is humongous. The lawsuits, the loss of life, the loss of parents, the loss of children. It's horrifying, and it probably has to change. So a lot of people weren't aware of these things, and hopefully you would do some more research, because I'm limited for time and telling you too much more. So I've told you about all of this. Let me finish up by telling you one last thing, what we can do about it as individuals in society, what we can do about it as citizens, if we care. We could do two things. We could say, well, these people must be doing something wrong, and there's a need for all these SWAT raids. There's a need for this because we live in a crazy society. Well, society has always been crazy. I mean, we've always lived in a crazy. Confucius says, may you live in interesting times. Well, we do. We live in very interesting times. However, when you're creating this warrior cop, is what you're doing. You are blurring the line between what the cause of the police department, what the purpose of the police is, and what the purpose of the soldier is. So what you should do, or what you can do, is you can get involved. We have an information superhighway. I'm talking to you right now through it. We can use this. We can use social media. We could use Facebook. We could use YouTube. We could promote this. We could talk about this. We could show this to our legislators. We can run for office. We could run for city council. We could talk about this at the school boards when they send SWAT teams into schools for sometimes ungodly reasons. I mean, this is, we live right now in a generation of fear. It's a society of fear. It's FUD. It's an acronym used by the military. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Keep people afraid and they'll accept anything. I don't accept this. I accept my responsibility to defend myself. I hope you accept your responsibility to defend yourself as well. Because I cannot trade my liberties for a little temporary security. As they say, once you have that temporary security and you have a standing army amongst us, the only thing we'll be missing is our liberty. Thank you.